Camel. That is a band name that I know will make a lot of people who were fans of classic prog rock from the early and middle 1970s smile. Camel's original lineup of Andrew Latimer, the late Peter Bardens, Doug Ferguson, and Andy Ward were technically very proficient players, and they emerged on the prog rock scene at a time in 1973 when you might have thought that they would have had everything going for them as far as their ability to achieve worldwide success. Sadly, that didn't happen. In this episode, I'm going to present my analysis of why it did not happen. To my thinking, Camel's lack of success, particularly in North America, had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with bad timing and with bad luck. Camel was formed in 1971 when keyboard player Peter Bardens joined guitarist Andrew Latimer, bassist Doug Ferguson, and drummer Andy Ward to form a four-piece band. They quickly gained traction on the music scene in the United Kingdom, probably because Peter Bardens had a rather impressive resume going back to the middle 1960s. He had been a member of the band Them with Van Morrison, and following that was a principal member of the band Shotgun Express, which helped to spawn the careers of Rod Stewart as well as of the original incarnation of Fleetwood Mac. Camel established themselves as fixtures on the live circuit in the UK, and before long were able to land a recording contract with MCA Records, for whom they made their first album, released in early 1973. Camel's first album was not one of their classics. Those would begin with their second album. But the first album is a solid one that, under normal circumstances, would have established them as a band to keep an eye on in the press and the public alike. It unfortunately didn't happen that way, though. Camel joined MCA Records at the precise time when the label was going through a fair amount of consolidation. MCA's president in the United States, Mike Maitland, was in the process in early 1973 of consolidating the assets of all of the record companies, including Decca Records, UNI Records, UNI for Universal City, and Cap Records, that were owned by what is now called the Universal Music Group. In performing that consolidation, Maitland not only merged various portions of MCA's back office facilities, but he also cut a number of bands from the various labels' rosters. And Camel, being a new band that hadn't distinguished themselves to quite the degree that might have been expected with their first album, were very likely affected by the purge that MCA was going through at this time. Undaunted, Camel's managers looked elsewhere to place the band and were able to quickly place them with the Decca Record Company in the UK, with Decca's DRAM Records label. On the surface, this looked like a nice match. Decca Records were well established in the UK, and the DRAM label focused on progressive rock, so it looked like their future in the UK certainly was secure. The problem, however, in signing with Decca DRAM was with American distribution. Decca Records UK had an American affiliate, the London Record Company, which also distributed DRAM in the United States as well. But they were going through a significant period of transition in the early 1970s. For much of the late 1960s, the fortunes of London Records were based on the success of two acts, the Rolling Stones and the Moody Blues. However, in 1970, the Rolling Stones left Decca Records in the UK and London Records in the United States. They formed Rolling Stones Records and affiliated at the time with Atlantic Records in the States. The Moody Blues, by 1973, were on hiatus. They had recently completed their tour in support of their 1972 album, Seventh Sojourn, and while the band was commercially on a high in 1972 between the success of Seventh Sojourn and the re-release and huge success of their 1967 song, Nights in White Satin, behind the scenes, the band was not working well together and decided to take a break, which at the time was uncertain as to whether the band would reunite. They ultimately did in 1977, but in 1973, that was by no means a certainty. Without the fortunes of the Rolling Stones or the Moody Blues to help buttress their other acts, London Records in the United States was reluctant to immediately pick up distribution of British acts, particularly acts that they weren't certain would be able to catch on with the general public. And so when Camel made their second album, Mirage, DRAM in the United States elected to not pick up the contract for distribution of the record. That did leave Camel free to sign with another label, and they did. They signed with a label called Janus Records. On the surface, that looked like it might have been a reasonable compromise for the band as well. Janus Records had been established in the States in 1969 as a joint venture between the British label Pi Records, who were in the 60s particularly rather substantial, and the American company GRT, General Recorded Tape, who made a significant amount of money working with the major labels for distribution of their albums in the cassette and 8-track formats. So it appeared, at least on the surface, that Janus would be able to provide the necessary support to Camel as far as touring and distribution of their albums were concerned. And this was a big deal to make sure that you had a good label behind you, because back in the 1973 timeframe, most touring was underwritten by labels in the United States. Touring was viewed as a means of marketing your album. Bands typically didn't make money from touring, although they did get per diems for purposes of staying at the hotels and eating. But their monies were made from record sales and pretty much nothing else. The challenge, however, that Camel had in being signed to Janus was that, in general, GRT's businesses were beginning to fail. Janus did not have a significant number of hit records in the United States, but at the same time as Janus was having hard times, so was GRT as a business. By 1973, the distribution of cassette and 8-track versions of major record releases was becoming big business, and American record labels were no longer willing to farm that business out to outside contractors. They began instead doing their own manufacturing of 8-tracks and cassettes and handling distribution of them directly. This meant that a significant amount of GRT's revenue stream was drying up, and as a result, they had very little opportunity to support the bands on the Janus label when it came to touring and promotion in general. Camel made 3 wonderful records as their first 3 records for Janus in the United States. Mirage in 1974, The Snow Goose in 1975, and Moon Madness in 1976. But because of GRT's financial problems, Janus's ability to support those releases was very, very compromised. While Camel came to the United States to tour in support of those 3 albums, they performed 50 dates over the course of those 3 tours. In the middle 1970s timeframe, bands didn't tour to the same degree as they do now. as I mentioned, their revenues were far more dependent directly on record sales. But a typical tour for an act in the States back then was in the neighborhood of about 40 or so dates in 1974, and by 1976 had grown to approximately double that. Playing 50 dates in the course of 3 years was a recipe for failure, and unfortunately, that's essentially what happened to Camel. They had very little exposure for their work. It also didn't help that a significant amount of Camel's repertoire was strictly instrumental. It pretty much relegated their music to programming in the late night time frames on American radio. And while there was a market for good instrumental prog, Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells in particular proved that, it was definitely a harder sell for radio programmers to take on these bands. And while Camel did some wonderful instrumental music, the Snow Goose in particular is entirely instrumental and is absolutely magnificent. It's one of the great records of instrumental and symphonic prog from the middle 70s. But even as good as the Snow Goose was, or for that matter, as good as some of the songs from Mirage and Moon Madness were, Camel, unfortunately, didn't get the level of support that they would have needed in order to be competitive and truly successful in North America. Camel remained with Janus for their 5th album, Rain Dances, before finally being able to move on from that contract and move to the Arista label. By this time, though, Doug Ferguson had already left the band, and the bottom line was Camel's opportunity to break in the United States had pretty much ended. Their window had closed. And it's a shame. This is a band that deserved far, far better than they got. The 3 albums that I mentioned that were their first 3 for Decca in the UK and for Janus in the United States, Mirage, The Snow Goose, and Moon Madness are all worth your time if you're a new prog rock listener. This is terrific music, and it definitely deserves your attention and your ear. Unfortunately, it didn't put very much money in the pockets of the members of the band. Anyway, that's my analysis. I'm curious to hear what you think as well. Feel free to let me know in the comments. If you liked the episode, please click on like. And of course, if you haven't already subscribed to Progpaganda, please join us here as well. We'll be bringing content of this nature to you on a regular basis, as always. You take good care, and we'll be back soon. Bye-bye.